I never thought I would end my days talking more to walls and clocks than to living people, but that has become my routine. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 76 years old, and I live alone in the house where my wife Margaret and I raised our only child, our daughter Elaine. Margaret passed away almost a decade ago, a quiet winter morning when her heart simply stopped beating. And since then, the silence in these rooms has been so heavy it feels like dust settling on everything. I wake up early, not because I have any pressing business, but because sleep no longer stays with me. My body stirs with aches and stiffness long before the sun rises, and I make my way to the kitchen, moving slowly down the hallway, my hand trailing along the wallpaper for balance, just to feel something solid under my palm. I boil water for tea the way Margaret used to do, although I never managed to get it to taste quite the same. She had a way of warming the pot first, swirling it with hot water, then steeping the leaves until the fragrance filled the room. Mine always tastes like boiled water with a hint of bitterness, but I drink it anyway, because the ritual makes me feel close to her. Most mornings I sit at the oak table by the window and sort through my pill bottles. They sit lined up like obedient soldiers, each one a reminder of my body's betrayals. The small white ones for the heart, the pink ones for cholesterol, the elongated yellow ones for the blood pressure, and a few others whose names I don't even try to remember anymore. I just know their shapes and the rhythm with which I am supposed to swallow them. It has been my way of keeping order in a life that otherwise feels unmoored. I take pride in laying them out carefully, preparing the weekly pill box, checking and double-checking, as if accuracy could somehow compensate for the helplessness that comes with age. That sense of control, however small, means something when so much else has been stripped away. I was an accountant for 42 years, a man who lived by numbers and certainty, and even in retirement, I still cling to precision. Numbers never lied to me. People did. Margaret never lied, not really, but my daughter has learned the art of telling me half the truth, of hiding things behind a smile, of speaking as if I should not notice. Elaine is 50 now, a career woman with a husband who, in my eyes, never once looked at me with respect, and 2 sons who treat me as if I am already a shadow. She comes around every week or so, sometimes less, often with the excuse that she is just checking in to make sure I haven't forgotten my medication or burned something on the stove. I know she believes she is being practical, but every visit feels more like an inspection than a conversation. She peers into the refrigerator, shakes her head at the outdated milk, straightens stacks of envelopes on the counter, all without asking me how I feel about any of it. There was a time, long ago, when Elaine would come running into this kitchen barefoot, hair tangled from sleep, and demand that I cut her pancakes into little squares because she liked them better that way. She would sit on Margaret's lap, chattering about school and friends, and I would watch them both, thinking I had built a life worth keeping. It is strange how a child's laughter can be the anchor of an entire household, and how that same child, once grown, can be the one who loosens the ropes until everything drifts apart. Now when Elaine visits, she sits across from me, arms folded, speaking in that patient tone people use with the elderly, as if every word must be simplified, as if I might lose the thread halfway through a sentence. She forgets that I still read newspapers cover to cover, that I still balance my own checkbook without error, that my mind, though slower, has not deserted me. I do not tell her this, because it would only make her sigh. Instead, I let her talk about what is best for me, about how a retirement community might provide more safety, about how medication schedules can become confusing, about how I should think of selling the house before it becomes too much for me to manage. She does not realize that every suggestion of hers, though delivered with a veneer of concern, sounds to me like an erosion of my dignity. Margaret would have seen it differently. She always believed in encouraging independence, even when it meant letting me make mistakes. She used to say, "Gerald, as long as you can decide for yourself, you are alive." I have held on to those words, and yet each time my daughter speaks, I feel the definition of alive narrowing. The house itself has become both my refuge and my prison. The walls carry photographs of decades gone by. Elaine in her prom dress, Margaret and I in front of Niagara Falls, the three of us at Christmas with wrapping paper littering the carpet. These pictures watch me as I shuffle from room to room, and I sometimes whisper to them, as if the images could answer. The clock in the living room ticks so loudly it seems to mock the silence, and at night the creaks in the floorboards are companions I almost welcome. My neighbors are polite, but they keep their distance, busy with their own families. The mailman is the only person who greets me daily, and even that is a fleeting nod as he hurries to the next house. I have grown used to solitude, but not immune to the ache of it. Physically, I am not what I once was. My knees complain with every stare, my heart skips beats now and then, and I know that without the medication lined up on my counter, I might not last long. Still, I cling to the rituals that remind me I am not yet defeated. I mow the lawn slowly, leaning on the handle, pausing often to catch my breath, but I finish it myself. I drive only to the grocery store, short trips that make me feel like part of the world, beyond these walls. And I keep my records neat, as if some invisible auditor might arrive one day to judge whether I have managed the last years of my life properly. That sense of order comforts me more than company ever could. Yet beneath all of this steadiness lies a quiet fear, one that grows each time Elaine visits. It is the fear that she sees me not as her father, but as a burden, a man already fading, someone whose choices no longer matter. I catch the quick glances she exchanges with her husband, the way they speak about me as if I were in another room, discussing what should be done, how much longer I can live on my own, what arrangements might need to be made. They underestimate me, thinking age has dulled not only my body but also my perception. It has not. I hear, I see, and I remember. And I know enough to sense when the ground beneath me is beginning to shift. For now, I keep my suspicions folded inside, the way I keep Margaret's letters in the drawer of my nightstand, but I cannot help noticing the subtle changes in Elaine's behavior. She insists more strongly each time that she should handle my prescriptions, that it would be safer if she managed my pills for me, that at your age, Dad, mistakes can be dangerous. I nod politely, though the words sting. Dangerous, yes, but not because of my own hands. Dangerous because I am beginning to wonder whether the hands that reach into my medicine box truly mean to protect me, or to hasten the quiet end that would make things easier for them. It is only a whisper of doubt for now, but in the silence of this house, even whispers echo loudly. It was in early spring, when the snow had finally begun to recede from the edges of the driveway, and the ground gave off that damp smell of thawing earth, that Elaine announced she would be taking over my pills. She arrived on a Sunday morning, unannounced as usual, letting herself in with the spare key I had foolishly given her years ago, calling out a quick greeting while already moving through the kitchen, as though it belonged more to her than to me. I was sitting at the table with my pill organizer open in front of me, carefully measuring the week ahead, and she stopped in the doorway with a look that managed to be both affectionate and reproachful. "Dad," she said, in that patient voice of hers, "you don't need to keep doing this by yourself anymore. It's too easy to make mistakes. We'll handle your pills from now on." She didn't ask. She didn't phrase it as a suggestion. She simply declared it, as if the decision had already been made somewhere else without me. I looked up at her, the sunlight from the window falling across her face, so that she looked, for a brief moment, like the little girl who used to tug at my sleeve when she wanted another bedtime story. But the softness of memory clashed with the firmness in her expression now, and I realized she was no longer the daughter seeking comfort, but the woman asserting control. I tried to protest gently, reminding her that I had been managing my medications without incident for years, that accuracy had been the cornerstone of my profession, and that I still retained enough sharpness to count out tablets correctly. She smiled the way one might smile at a child insisting he can tie his own shoes, and told me that things change, that no one can escape the little slips of age, that it was better to be safe than sorry. I could feel the indignation rising in me, the sense that she was speaking not to her father, but to some doddering ward. Yet at the same time I felt the sting of doubt. Had I truly lost enough clarity to warrant her intervention? Was I becoming the man she described, confused and accident-prone, even though my mind told me otherwise? She reached across the table, closed the pill organizer with a snap, and told me she would bring a new one next week, a larger box with more compartments, one that she and her husband would fill for me every Sunday. This way, she said, you won't have to worry. You'll just open the right slot each morning and take what's there. Simple. The words sounded kind, but I heard in them something else, a note of finality, as though she had closed a door behind me and thrown away the key. Margaret's voice came back to me then, her insistence that as long as I could decide for myself I was alive, and I felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen. Elaine must have seen something flicker across my face, because she reached out and patted my hand, calling me Dad, in that soothing tone that carried no warmth, only reassurance, designed to quiet resistance. When she left later that afternoon, promising to return with the new pill box and a stack of neatly labeled bottles, I sat at the table staring at the closed organizer. It was such a small thing, really, the surrender of a routine task, but it carried with it the weight of something far larger. It was the first official admission, not by me, but by her, that I was no longer considered capable of managing my own life. I remember sitting there long after the light faded from the window, listening to the tick of the clock, asking myself if I had just agreed to the beginning of the end. Over the following days, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was only convenience, that Elaine wanted to spare me trouble, that perhaps her motives, however heavy-handed, were rooted in concern. Yet every time I walked past the counter and saw the bottles waiting for her to collect, I felt an odd dislocation, as though part of my independence had been boxed up and set aside. I began to dread her next visit, not because I didn't want to see my daughter, but because I feared what new decision might be imposed on me under the guise of care. When Sunday arrived, she returned with a plastic container the size of a small toolbox, with each day divided into morning and evening slots. She took out my bottles, counted the pills briskly, and filled the compartments with a precision that might have impressed me once, but now only reminded me of how unnecessary it was. She spoke the whole time, explaining which pills went where, as though I hadn't been swallowing them faithfully for years. And when she finished, she snapped the lid shut with satisfaction and slid it across the table to me. There, she said, now you don't have to worry about anything. I forced a smile, thanked her, and tried not to let her see how much it cost me. Inside I felt diminished, like a man rehearsing his own exit, a man whose choices were being whittled away piece by piece until nothing remained but compliance. That night, lying in bed with the pill box on the nightstand beside me, I stared at it for a long time, the compartments gleaming under the lamplight, and wondered whether I had just entrusted not only my health, but my very life to someone who no longer saw me as a person in full. It was the smallest of changes, yet it carried the gravity of a storm, the kind you only recognize once it has already begun to tear at the roof over your head. At first, I tried to convince myself that handing over the responsibility of sorting the pills was a small concession, nothing more than a daughter's concern expressed through practical means, but within weeks, the uneasiness grew into something heavier, a stone lodged in the pit of my stomach that refused to be ignored. Each morning, I would open the large plastic container Elaine had so proudly brought me, listening to the little click of the lid, and I would stare at the compartment as if it held not medicine, but a puzzle I was no longer trusted to solve. The pills lay in neat rows, different colors and shapes like fragments of a mosaic, and although I recognized them all, something about the arrangement unsettled me. One morning, the compartment seemed to contain fewer pills than I expected. Another morning, more. And though I had long ago memorized my regimen, I told myself that perhaps I was misremembering. Perhaps my eyes deceived me. Perhaps the doubt was mine. Alone. After all, wasn't that exactly what Elaine had said? That confusion came with age? That mistakes were inevitable? It was easier to swallow the doubt than to challenge her. Easier to obey the instruction of the box than to raise questions that might sound like paranoia. But soon the body spoke in ways I could not dismiss. There were afternoons when a sudden fog would descend over me, leaving me drowsy at the kitchen table, the newspaper unread, my head sinking forward until I startled awake, not knowing how long I had been gone. There were nights when my heart raced violently in my chest, thudding against my ribs as if trying to break free, leaving me clutching the sheets in fear that I might not live until morning. And there were mornings when my legs trembled under me, my balance uncertain, so that I had to grip the counter to steady myself. I thought at first these were simply the indignities of age, the inevitable decline that Margaret had been spared by dying too soon. But the timing began to trouble me. The symptoms grew more pronounced in the hours after I had taken the pills, and though I tried not to connect the two, the suspicion whispered persistently in the back of my mind. One evening, Elaine came by with her husband, Robert, a man whose presence always filled the house with a kind of heavy silence, as if he were silently measuring every object for its worth rather than noticing the memories attached to it. They brought takeout dinner, cartons of Chinese food that we ate in the living room while the television murmured in the background. Elaine asked if I had been taking my medication on schedule, and I answered truthfully that I had followed the compartments exactly as she had set them. She nodded approvingly, as if I were a student passing a test, and told me how relieved she was to know I wasn't forgetting. Robert added with a faint smirk that it was best to keep things simple at my age, best not to strain myself with too much responsibility. I laughed along stiffly, though the words cut deep. I remembered a time when he came to me for advice about mortgages and investments, when my knowledge was something he envied, and now he dismissed me as though my mind had already withered away. Later that night, when they had gone, I emptied the day's compartment into my palm and studied the pills carefully. I knew the shapes, I knew the dosages, I'd read the instructions from my doctor so many times that they were etched in memory, and yet something seemed wrong. There were 2 small white tablets of the heart medicine where there should have been one, and the blood pressure pill seemed absent altogether. I sat there under the dim light of the kitchen, my hand trembling slightly, trying to decide whether my recollection was faulty or whether the arrangement before me was not a mistake at all. It is a terrifying thing to be unsure of one's own mind, to realize that doubt corrodes even the most basic certainties. I considered calling Elaine, but I could already hear her voice telling me that confusion is normal, that I had probably taken the missing pill earlier without realizing it, that I should stop worrying so much. So I said nothing, replaced the pills in the compartment, and went to bed uneasy, listening to my heartbeat as though it were a ticking clock counting down. The next day, I resolved to pay closer attention, to keep notes the way I once kept ledgers, to track not only what pills appeared in each slot, but also how I felt afterward. I found an old notebook in the drawer of Margaret's writing desk and began to record the colors and numbers each morning, writing slowly but carefully, my accountant's instinct returning with each line. The entries began to reveal patterns, days when the dosages doubled, days when something was missing, days when the symptoms flared in predictable ways. The evidence was faint but growing, and with it grew my unease. One afternoon, while Elaine was in the kitchen tidying up, I overheard her speaking in a low voice on the phone. She did not know I was in the hallway just beyond the door, hidden by the angle of the wall, and I caught fragments of her words. Yes, he's been more tired lately, sometimes confused. We'll need the paperwork soon. Robert says it's better to handle it before the summer. The words chilled me because I recognized their meaning. Paperwork. Confused. Better to handle it. They were not speaking of medicine anymore, but of arrangements, of legal documents, of decisions made over my life as though I were already absent from it. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, until she hung up and called out my name cheerfully, asking if I wanted tea. I answered calmly, but inside the fear coiled tighter. From that moment, I watched her more closely, though always in silence. Each time she came with the pill box, I checked her hands, the way she counted, the way she pressed the lid shut. I noticed how she never let me see the bottles anymore, how she whisked them into her bag before I could glance at the labels, as though the sight of them was no longer my right. And I noticed how Robert looked at me, not with concern, but with calculation, as though each symptom of weakness was a number in a column adding up to some conclusion he and Elaine had already reached. The turning point came one morning when I opened the box and found the compartment filled with twice the usual number of pills, a deadly cocktail if swallowed whole. I remember sitting very still, staring at the bright tablets against the plastic, realizing that this was no simple error. My hands shook as I closed the lid, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. If I had followed blindly, if I had obeyed the box as I was expected to, I might not have lived to see the next sunrise. For the first time, the suspicion hardened into certainty, and certainty into fear. Something was happening, something deliberate, and I was standing at the edge of it alone. The morning I discovered the double dose was the morning everything inside me shifted, as if some curtain had been pulled back, and I could no longer pretend that what I felt was simply the paranoia of an old man, because there in the palm of my hand lay the proof that my life could be ended not by the steady decline of age, but by the deliberate misplacement of pills, a method so quiet and so deniable that no one would ever question it. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the pills for what felt like hours, listening to the relentless ticking of the wall clock and feeling the weight of realization pressing against my chest. My own daughter, the child whose forehead I kissed when she had fevers, the girl I taught to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot, the young woman whose wedding toast I rehearsed for weeks, had either through negligence or intention placed me in the path of death, and that knowledge seeped through me like cold water. It was not just the mistake itself, it was the certainty that if I mentioned it, she would smile patiently and tell me that confusion was normal, that perhaps I had miscounted, that stress can make things seem different than they are. She had already been laying that groundwork for months, planting the idea of forgetfulness, of decline, of incompetence, so that if I spoke up, I would sound only like a man slipping into dementia. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. That I was being maneuvered into a position where my own testimony about my life would carry no weight. That afternoon, I made an appointment with my doctor, a man I had known for 20 years who had seen me through Margaret's illness, and who, though younger than me by decades, still sometimes listened, as if my words carried authority. I brought with me the pill box, careful not to disturb the evidence, and when I laid it on his desk and showed him the duplicate dosage, his face changed in a way that told me he understood the seriousness immediately. He asked questions about who prepared my pills, how often, whether anyone else had access, and though I tried to speak calmly, my voice shook as I admitted that my daughter insisted on managing them. He frowned, leaned back in his chair, and said that such a dosage, if swallowed, could very easily have triggered a heart failure in someone with my condition. He offered to document his findings in my file, and for the first time, I felt the ground steady beneath me. If Elaine tried to argue that my memory was failing, at least there would be a professional record that I had noticed an error and brought it forward. It was a small shield, but in that moment it felt like armor. On the way home, I thought about Margaret, about how she would have reacted if she had known that our daughter was not simply neglectful, but perhaps dangerous. Margaret had always given Elaine the benefit of the doubt, even when the girl was selfish or cold, insisting that she would soften with time, that once she had children of her own, she would understand the value of family. But now the children were grown, the husband entrenched, and the woman my daughter had become was harder than I could have imagined. I could almost hear Margaret's voice telling me to be careful, to protect myself, to see the truth, no matter how bitter. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I knew that the silence had to end, that whatever comfort came from pretending would only serve those who wanted to erase me. That evening, Elaine and Robert came by with forced cheerfulness, asking about my day, inquiring about the doctor's visit, offering to tidy up the yard once the weather warmed. I watched them closely, their eyes flickering with the nervousness of people who knew more than they admitted, and I realized then that I could not confront them directly, not yet, because they had the advantage of narrative. They had already begun telling others that I was forgetful, already casting me in the role of an old man slipping away. And if I accused them without preparation, it would only confirm their story. What I needed was proof, undeniable proof, and allies who could not be dismissed. I began keeping the notebook more diligently, recording every pill, every symptom, every irregularity with the precision of the accountant I once was. I made copies of the entries and stored them in different places. A small folder at the library, another envelope left with an old friend, so that if anything happened to me, there would be a record beyond my house. I asked the pharmacist quietly to print duplicate receipts of my prescriptions, and when he looked at me curiously, I told him I liked to keep my files complete, an explanation that satisfied him. Each of these actions felt like placing bricks in a wall, a defense against the invisible siege tightening around me. The moment of true clarity came not from the pillbox, but from a conversation I overheard late one evening. Elaine thought I was asleep in my chair in the living room, but my ears, though dulled, were still sharp enough to catch the murmur of her voice in the kitchen. She was speaking to Robert, and the words floated down the hallway like whispers from a trial. "If we get the paperwork in order before the summer, it will be easier," she said. "The lawyer said we only need a doctor's note about memory issues. Dad's already showing signs. Once that's filed, the accounts will be secure. We won't have to worry." Robert muttered something I couldn't catch, and she replied, "It's better this way. Safer. He won't even realize what's happening." My chest went cold, my breath shallow, as I understood fully for the first time that they were not simply caretaking, they were plotting. It wasn't only the pills. It was the house, the accounts, the entire remainder of my life they sought to take under their authority, as if I were already gone, and all that remained was to collect the estate. I sat very still, pretending to sleep, but inside me, something hardened. Fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was the kind of fear that sharpens into resolve, that forces a man to prepare for a fight he never thought he would have with his own blood. From that night onward, I knew there would be no returning to the illusion of safety, no pretending that Elaine's intentions were merely misguided love. This was war, silent and polite on the surface, but war nonetheless, and I would not surrender quietly. Once the veil was lifted, and I knew beyond denial that my daughter and her husband were maneuvering not simply to control my medicine, but to wrest away every last decision of my life, the world around me began to feel both sharper and more dangerous. As though the familiar walls of my own house had become a stage set where every sound carried double meaning and every gesture hid an intention. I found myself watching the pillbox as though it were a weapon disguised as a household object, and each time I lifted the lid, I did so with the same tension one feels handling something volatile, knowing it could explode if handled without care. I continued to make meticulous notes in my ledger, each entry a small rebellion against the narrative of forgetfulness they were weaving. And with each page I filled, I felt a strange mixture of dread and vindication. Because the more I wrote, the clearer it became that the errors in dosage were not random slips, but part of a pattern that would, if followed blindly, shorten my life under the guise of care. It was not only the medicine that revealed their intentions, but also the conversations they allowed me to overhear, perhaps thinking my hearing was as diminished as they pretended, or perhaps careless in their certainty that they already owned my silence. Elaine spoke with the lawyer more often, always lowering her voice in the kitchen or stepping onto the porch, but I caught fragments that lodged in my mind like shards. Guardianship, transfer of assets, power of attorney, words that to an accountant carry precise meanings, words that spelled the stripping of independence, the legal death of a man still breathing. One afternoon, I deliberately shuffled into the kitchen while she was on the phone, making a show of looking for a glass of water, and though she ended the call quickly, I saw the way her eyes flicked to Robert, a silent signal that told me the conversation had been about me, and in that look was a kind of guilt so quickly buried under a smile that I knew I was not imagining anything. Robert, for his part, grew bolder in his disdain. He began to make small remarks that would seem like jokes to an outsider, but to me carried the sting of preparation. "Don't worry, Dad," he said one evening, when I mislaid my reading glasses. "We'll take care of everything once you don't remember where the house is either." He laughed as though it were harmless banter, but Elaine did not laugh. She looked at him sharply, then at me, as though gauging whether I had understood. I smiled thinly, said nothing, and tucked the memory away in my notebook later that night. Another brick for the wall I was building. The strain on my body deepened, and there were days when I could feel the pulse in my temples hammering harder than usual, when dizziness made me grasp the edge of the table to remain upright, and I realized with a sick certainty that the dosages were not only inconsistent but dangerous. One morning I deliberately left the pills untouched, pretending I had taken them, and by afternoon I felt clearer, stronger, the fog that had clung to me for weeks, lifting just enough for me to breathe easily. That experiment confirmed what my instincts had been whispering all along. It was not my age that was dragging me down so suddenly. It was the hand that filled the compartments. I began discarding certain doses, hiding them in the hollow space behind a loose tile under the sink, knowing that if I threw them in the trash, Elaine might notice, and soon I had a little collection of white and pink tablets tucked away, each one a piece of evidence that could one day speak on my behalf, if my voice was silenced. The psychological pressure increased as well. Elaine began to speak more openly about the future, not in terms of holidays or family gatherings, but in terms of arrangements. "It's just practical, Dad," she would say, sitting across from me with a folder of brochures for assisted living facilities. "These places are wonderful, with trained staff, social activities, medical supervision 24 hours a day. You'd be safer there, and Robert and I would have peace of mind." I looked at the photographs she slid across the table, images of smiling gray-haired residents playing cards or doing chair exercises, and felt my chest tighten. They looked like prisons disguised as resorts, and I could imagine myself there, another old man parked in a recliner, while strangers dictated every aspect of my life. I told her firmly that I would not leave my house, that as long as I could walk and speak, I would live where Margaret and I had built our years, and she sighed as though indulging a stubborn child, saying softly, "We'll see, Dad, we'll see." The words were not a concession. They were a promise that the decision would eventually be taken out of my hands. It was around this time that I noticed changes in the way my neighbors looked at me. Mrs. Keating from across the street asked kindly if I was managing all right, and when I said yes, she tilted her head and murmured that Elaine had mentioned I was sometimes forgetful, that she had found me wandering outside at odd hours. The shock of hearing this was like a blow to the chest. I had never wandered outside at night. I had never forgotten where I lived. But my own daughter was planting stories among the community, stories that would, when repeated enough, form the image of a man no longer competent. Even the pharmacist gave me a strange look when I picked up a refill, asking politely if I wanted him to go over the instructions again, just in case. I smiled, said I remembered perfectly, but inside I burned with the knowledge that Elaine was poisoning not only my body but also my reputation, one whisper at a time. The culmination of this escalation came the evening I overheard them arguing in the kitchen, while they thought I was asleep in the living room. Robert's voice was raised, sharp with impatience. "We can't drag this out forever," he said. "The accounts are just sitting there, and the house is worth more now than it's ever been. What if something happens before we've secured it? What if he changes the will?" Elaine tried to shush him, but he continued. "The longer we wait, the harder it will be. You said the doctor would sign off. What's the delay?" I could feel my throat tighten as I listened, realizing that my own flesh and blood were treating my continued survival as an inconvenience, a risk to their plans. And though Elaine's reply was softer, I caught the words, "Be patient," and "soon," and one more note from the doctor. That was when I understood fully that this was not care gone astray. This was premeditated. This was an attempt to erase me on paper before my body had even surrendered. From that night forward, every sound in the house became suspect, every conversation a potential piece of evidence, and I began to live in a state of hyper-vigilance I had never known even in my working years. I locked my bedroom door at night, though I knew it would not stop them if they wished to force it. And I began hiding my important documents in places even I could barely remember, rotating them weekly so that if Elaine searched, she would not find anything. I contacted my lawyer quietly, arranging a meeting under the pretense of updating my insurance, and there I told him everything, every suspicion, every note, every misplaced pill. He listened carefully, his brow furrowed, and finally told me that I must be cautious, that if Elaine and Robert were already preparing guardianship papers, they might try to present me as delusional, and that my best defense was to document, meticulously, and to undergo an independent medical evaluation proving my competence. I agreed, feeling both humiliated and strangely empowered, because though it pained me to have to prove my sanity, it also gave me a weapon to counter theirs. I left that office with a strange mixture of fear and determination coursing through me. Fear that my own daughter would not stop until she had me declared incompetent, and determination that I would not let her succeed. The days that followed were filled with small tests of will, pretending to take the pills while secretly discarding them, enduring Elaine's patient smiles without betraying my knowledge, answering Robert's condescension with silence while noting every word. Each act of endurance felt like a battle won in a war I had never asked for, and though I felt older than ever, I also felt more awake, more alive than I had in years, because nothing sharpens a man's sense of self like the realization that others are trying to erase it, and nothing steals his will like the knowledge that survival itself has become an act of resistance. The day I finally decided to act did not arrive with thunder or revelation, but with a quiet inevitability, as if all the pieces of dread and suspicion I had been gathering in my notebook had finally assembled themselves into a picture too clear to deny. I woke early that morning, the house still cloaked in gray light, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the pillbox Elaine had filled 2 days earlier. The compartments gleamed under the dim bulb, little plastic coffins. And I realized I could no longer live with the ritual of lifting those lids, pretending obedience, while secretly discarding half the contents, because each time I played that charade I gave them more control over me, allowed them to believe they were steering the course of my life. I thought of Margaret, of her insistence that as long as I decided for myself I was alive, and I knew that the only way to honor her memory was to reclaim what remained of my autonomy. That morning, instead of taking the pills, I carried the entire box in a small brown bag and drove myself to the doctor's office without telling Elaine. My hands shook on the steering wheel, not from weakness, but from the tension of secrecy, from the knowledge that what I was about to do was both an act of defiance and of survival. When I placed the pill box on his desk and asked him to examine it, he frowned as he counted, his lips pressing into a thin line, and after several minutes he looked at me gravely and said what I already knew. The dosages were dangerously inconsistent, some compartments holding nearly double the prescribed amount. He wrote a detailed note, stamped and signed, documenting his findings, and when I asked for a copy, he handed it to me without hesitation. That paper felt heavier than any document I had ever held in my career. It was not just a note, it was a shield, proof that my mind was intact and that the danger was real. From there, I went directly to my lawyer, carrying both the doctor's letter and my notebook filled with weeks of entries. I laid everything on his polished wooden desk and watched his eyes move across the pages, his expression tightening as the pattern became undeniable. He asked me if I wanted to file a criminal complaint, if I believed my daughter's actions were deliberate attempts on my life, and I told him that intention was harder to prove than effect, but that I knew in my bones what was happening. He nodded slowly and said that even without criminal charges, the evidence was strong enough to revoke any attempt at guardianship, and that we could immediately draft new documents securing my estate in ways Elaine could not touch. I authorized him to rewrite my will, removing her entirely and leaving what I had to my grandchildren only on the condition that neither she nor Robert be granted control. It was the most painful signature I have ever placed, the severing of a bond I had once believed unbreakable. But as my pen scratched across the paper, I felt a grim relief, as though I had cut away a tumor before it consumed the rest of me. That evening when Elaine arrived, breezing into the house with her usual air of brisk competence, I was waiting for her at the table. She carried a new set of bottles in a paper bag, ready to refill the compartments. But I stopped her with a raised hand. "You don't need to do that anymore," I said, my voice calm but sharper than she expected. She blinked, startled, and tried to smile. "Dad, don't be stubborn. You know it's safer if I handle this." I slid the doctor's note across the table toward her, watched her eyes scan the words, and saw the color drain from her face. "The pills have been wrong for weeks," I told her. "Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The doctor has confirmed it. I know what you've been doing, Elaine, and I won't allow it any longer." For a long moment she said nothing, only stared at the paper as though it might vanish if she willed it hard enough. Then she tried to laugh, a brittle sound, and insisted it must have been an accident, that perhaps she was tired, that filling pill boxes was more confusing than I realized. But I shook my head. "I was an accountant for 40 years, I said. "I know the difference between a mistake and a pattern, and I've heard your conversations. I know about the guardianship, about the lawyer, about Robert's impatience to claim this house. You've forgotten that even an old man can still hear, still think, still remember." Her lips pressed into a tight line, the mask of concern cracking to reveal something colder beneath, and she whispered, "You don't understand, Dad. We were only trying to protect you." I leaned forward and answered, "No. You were trying to erase me before my time." The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall like a hammer striking metal. Finally, she gathered the papers, shoved them back toward me, and muttered something about leaving. Robert was waiting outside in the car, and when she walked past me to the door, she did not meet my eyes. I let her go without another word, because there was nothing left to say. The truth had been spoken aloud, and whatever bond of trust remained between us was shattered beyond repair. That night I locked the doors and sat in the living room with Margaret's photograph on the mantel, staring at her face and asking silently if I had done the right thing. It felt like betrayal to cut off my only child, yet I knew the greater betrayal would have been to let her succeed, to allow myself to be silenced in the name of her convenience. For the first time in months, I swallowed my pills with certainty, each dosage measured correctly by my own hands, and though the bitterness lingered on my tongue, it carried with it a strange sweetness, the taste of survival. I knew the battle was not finished, that Elaine might still try to claim what she believed hers. But I also knew I had reclaimed the ground beneath my feet, and that as long as I could act, I would fight. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, the house returned to its familiar silence, yet it was no longer the oppressive silence of fear, but the quieter, steadier silence of a man who had survived a storm and now sat among the wreckage counting. What remained? Elaine did not come by again. Not a phone call, not a visit, and Robert's car no longer appeared in the driveway with its impatient hum. At first I expected some dramatic retaliation, a letter from a lawyer, a sudden attempt to force guardianship, but none came, and slowly I understood that they had been caught off guard, that the papers I placed before her and the resolve in my voice had dismantled the fragile story they had been building about my incompetence. Without the narrative of confusion, without the doctor's complicity, they had nothing. And so they chose the only weapon left to them: absence. It was a crueler punishment than I would have admitted aloud, for though their visits had been poisoned with suspicion and control, they were still visits, still human presence in a life otherwise emptied of voices. Now the house was truly mine again, but at the cost of blood ties severed, and each night as I sat by the lamp with Margaret's photograph, I felt the weight of solitude heavier than before. Yet along with the loneliness came a strange pride, a sense that I had drawn a line and held it, that I had refused to let myself be erased, and that dignity, though it cannot be touched or measured, has a taste sweeter than companionship offered in deceit. I carried on with my routines as if to prove to myself that nothing essential had been lost. I filled my own pillbox carefully, marking each compartment with deliberate precision, and each morning when I swallowed the tablets, I felt not only the medicine at work, but the victory of having chosen it myself. I walked slowly to the grocery store, nodded to the neighbors, who still looked at me with cautious curiosity, and when Mrs. Keating mentioned that Elaine had not been around lately, I only smiled and said that children have busy lives. I did not share the truth, not because I wished to protect Elaine's reputation, but because I had no desire to wear my wounds as spectacle. Some injuries are better kept within the walls that know them. My lawyer called to confirm that all documents had been updated, that my estate was secure from interference, and I felt a strange peace knowing that when my time finally came, the choices would be mine, and not dictated by those waiting impatiently for my departure. I left small letters sealed in envelopes for my grandchildren, not to burden them with the sins of their parents, but to remind them of the man I had been, the man who once taught their mother to ride a bicycle, the man who balanced books and numbers with precision and who refused, even at the end, to be counted out. Perhaps one day they will read those letters and wonder why the bond between generations was broken. And perhaps they will see that love is not measured by inheritance or control, but by the respect given to another's right to live his life to the end. In the evenings, I sometimes sit by the window and watch the shadows stretch across the lawn. And in those long, quiet hours, I speak softly to Margaret, as if she were still sitting across from me with her tea. I tell her that I have kept her promise, that I have decided for myself, that I have not allowed others to take away the essence of being alive. I tell her that it was painful, that it broke something in me to turn against our only child, but that the greater pain would have been surrender, the slow drowning of my will in a sea of false concern. I like to believe she would nod, that she would understand, that she would place her warm hand over mine, as she once did, and remind me that survival itself is a form of love. So here I remain, an old man in a quiet house, not victorious in any grand sense, but intact, still breathing, still choosing, still remembering. The world may look at me and see only fragility, but I know the truth, that in the face of betrayal, I found the strength to defend my own existence, that even in the twilight years of a life, one can claim a kind of justice, not the loud justice of courts or punishments, but the silent justice of refusing to be erased. And when my last day does come, it will not be by the hands of those who sought to hurry it, but in the natural rhythm of time, in the quiet certainty that I endured, that I remained myself until the end.